If you're constantly complaining about tight hip flexors like the other 90% of the world, then most likely you have a limitation in hip extension, which is the ability for your hip flexor muscles to express eccentric behavior or lengthen out. So in this video, I'm going to show you my favorite ways to improve hip flexor flexibility and actually create long-term adaptations. Because let's be honest, drills like these just simply aren't going to cut it, because there's just simply not enough load and leverage to create any meaningful adaptation. And most often when people perform these drills over and over again, they just find themselves in a rabbit hole of statically stretching every single day, and they always wake up feeling the exact same. Now make sure you stick around till the end of this video, because I'm going to lay out the perfect program that's only going to take you 15 to 20 minutes a few days a week, so you could screenshot that and get right to work. So let's dive into the video. So when it comes to improving hip flexor flexibility and hip extension, we need to think about our hip flexors like layers of an onion, and we need to peel back those superficial layers one by one so we can get to the deeper levels of the hip flexors like the psoas and iliacus. So the first superficial layer is the rectus femoris muscle, which connects from the top of the knee to the front of the hip. If this muscle is tight, it will restrict knee flexion and hip extension. But oftentimes when people just jump right to psoas stretches like kneeling lunge stretches, it just feels really uncomfortable because this rectus femoris muscle is guarding. So I always like to start people out with doing some form of rectus femoris stretching. Now, most commonly people will use the couch stretch. And the problem with this, especially for beginners, is they just jam themselves into end range knee flexion and really tax the distal end of that muscle, and they don't have any more room to actually extend the hip, which is what we're going after. So how I like to mitigate that is do this on an incline bench where we can slant our shin angle. So I'm going to get on the incline bench, put the knee in the corner here of the seat and backrest. And now what I really like about this position is we're not worried about the front hip flexion. A lot of times people who are limited in hip flexion, maybe they have a pinchy hip on that front leg, when they're jammed into that 90 degrees of hip flexion already, it's tough for them to find a stretch. So we're just taking this whole front leg out of the equation. Now, I call this the reclined couch stretch because this is going to be a more dynamic and loaded variation for the quad muscle here. So we're going to be very active in the stretch. We're going to lean back as if we're doing a reverse Nordic curl or active hero type of exercise. So we're going to initiate, squeeze the glutes, bring the ribs down, get the abs involved, and then we're going to bring this leg back so the foot is in line with the knee. And then I'm going to lean back, okay? So I'm trying to bring my heel toward my butt like we do in a couch stretch, but I'm keeping my rib position from the start. I'm not overly arching to get into the stretch, okay? So it's just this backward translation of the entire torso as I get my butt toward the heel, okay? Abs stay on, butt stays squeezed, and I feel a lot of length and load going through this quad and front of the hip, okay? We can do arms overhead as well to get a little bit extra load going through there, but I will say this is quite heavy. We could do a little rotation at the trunk to stretch that hip flexor a little bit more. So a really good step up from the couch stretch. So we could do this dynamically for repetitions with a little bit of a hold on each repetition in that stretch position, making sure we're engaging the stretch muscle as we come out of it. We're not just passively coming out through trunk flexion. We're actually driving the foot into the bench and knee down into the bench as well. So we're strengthening the quad in its lengthened position. We can progress this by moving it down to the floor, and we can choose a low box to elevate the foot. So notice it's not starting me in this end range knee flexion like it would in a couch stretch. I have my foot on a low box and my knee is about 6 inches to a foot away from the box. Now I'm going to elevate my foot so much that it brings me into end range hip flexion on the opposing limb, which will relatively extend the hip on the working side leg. because this will posteriorly tilt the pelvis, which we know is a hip extension from a pelvis point of view. So from here, we can lean back, and already I start to feel that stretch much more. Okay, so a lot of loading going through that quad muscle. Again, we could go arms overhead. Oh, and I feel that intensely through the front of the hip. Really nice variation here. Again, we can hold on to something if we need to. This is a lot of load going through that quad, but still very accessible for a lot of people. Okay, the biggest key here is we want to make sure we're not losing that hip extension. That's the main point we want to drive across with these. Once you start to see this, okay, I no longer feel that stretch in the front of the hip. I'm just flexing my knee. So extend the hip, squeeze the butt, crunch the abs. We should already feel that hip flexor stretch, and just translating the body back from there. So again, give this a try. Dynamic repetitions with a hold on each rep. Much more effective than that couch stretch. Okay, next is the front foot elevated box hip flexor stretch. Now this is a really good exercise. We're going to start getting into straight leg hip flexor stretching so we can access some of the deeper layers of hip flexors, specifically the psoas and the iliacus, as well as some of the short adductors, which also help flex the hip. Now this is a very accessible position for most people, even if you have tight hips. And the tighter hips you have, the better it is, because when we elevate this front leg, it brings us into max hip flexion, which will posteriorly tilt the pelvis on the working side leg, bringing us already into that hip flexor stretch without needing to move back into a ton of hip extension. So I'm going to set up. I'm going to get on my toes. I'm going to bring my leg back in as much hip extension as I can. Now from here, you can already see I'm getting a nice good stretch here, and my spine isn't overly extending. Okay, so we can start in this position. We can kind of hunt around. We can contract, relax. We can try to squeeze the ground together and drive the foot down into the box. So we're creating an isometric with the hip flexor. Contract, relax, sink deeper into the stretch. We can also do a loaded variation where I take a weight and go overhead. I could do these kind of forward translations like this. I can even do some side bending, which is a really nice one. Get into that whole lateral dimension of the trunk and hip flexor, trying to bring my opposite arm toward the ground while keeping my pelvis square. I can even do some back extensions. Notice as I extend my spine, my pelvis has to translate forward to counteract, which gives a huge stretch into the front line of the body without having to go too far back. So we have a few different options there. Also, I like to do some active knee extensions with the weight underneath. Okay, so I try to straighten out the leg as much as I can, and I just get my torso as upright as I can, which doesn't allow my low back to compensate. If I start too much upright like this, then maybe it's a lot of low back that's doing the motion, so I can keep the trunk flexed. Drive that heel back. Really squeeze the glute. I'm going to show you that side bending variation from front on, just so you can get an idea of how that looks. Overhead, pelvis is square. As you can see, you don't need a ton of extra range of motion here to get a huge stretch, because that front leg elevation is already taking up that slack in the hip joint. So we have some options to play with here. You can do some dynamic reps, some static holds, some contract, relax, and enjoy it. And lastly, I find the long lunge to be one of the most versatile ways to improve hip extension flexibility. But we're going to do it in a specific way. Most of the time when people set up in a lunge with their torso upright, they have too much knee bend because of tight hip flexors. And this is going to place too much load through the distal knee on the back leg. So what we want is that straight leg to really bias the loading through the proximal hip flexors here and get that glute active. So how we're going to enter this stretch is we're going to sink as low as we can into hip flexion on the front leg. and make sure we can get as straight of a leg on the back leg, and we can incline our torso forward so we can achieve that. If we start off too much upright, then it's going to take up all the slack in hip extension from top down. So we're going to start off hinged forward, okay? It's kind of like a Spider-Man lunge. Straighten out the leg, and from here, come up just enough to where our knee doesn't bend significantly, and we can keep that glute engaged. So we're going to do dynamic reps, moving forward and up. Forward and up, making sure we're not losing hip flexion on the front leg as we come up. We're staying low. Okay, so we're basically taking up all the slack as we move into hip extension from top down, because reclining that torso back is hip extension. We're making sure we're not just arching the spine, but we're translating the whole trunk backwards in space, okay? So we can try that out. Now, how we can facilitate this using some resistance is we can do a banded row as we're doing the long lunge. So my back leg is already pretty cooked, but I'll bust out a few more reps. Okay, so back leg nice and straight. I have the band anchored about knee height of my front leg, and I'm going to row as I extend the trunk, trying to get upright. Okay, notice the row isn't just here through the upper back, but it's resisting that torso extension backwards. Ooh, really challenging exercise. A lot of hard work from the glute to actively extend the hip at the top. It's almost like doing an RDL with an outstretched leg for hip flexor flexibility. How can we progress this even further? Is we could elevate the back leg on a plate. So I'm going to place my toes on a plate back here, and this is just bringing us into more hip extension in the back leg. So I could go through the exact same cues, folding forward and coming up. Think big glute squeeze at the top as we keep that knee extended. Again, some dynamic repetitions back and forth, maybe 8 to 12 repetitions with a 10 to 20 second static hold on the last rep. Okay, so as promised, here's the program laid out for you. Twice a week, every 3 to 4 days. Now, it's a simple setup, only 2 exercises. Commonly, when you find stretching programs online, you're going to find a bunch of different stretches that kind of just do the same thing. My preference is to choose 2 or 3 really challenging drills that address your main limitation and hit them hard with some intensity, instead of just going through the motions with a bunch of different exercises that really aren't intense enough to elicit any sort of long-term adaptation anyways. You're going to perform this program twice a week with at least 72 hours rest in between, and I would recommend you perform this before any sort of strength training for the lower body. Remember, what you prioritize is what you're going to see the best results in. Loaded flexibility training is a strength training stimulus and requires a lot of neurologic demand. I always recommend you do flexibility sessions when you're fresh, regardless if it has any negative impact to your strength training afterwards. If you are worried about the very, very, very slight drop in strength after, then you can just perform it 4 to 7 hours after your main strength work. So let's talk about the structure. Each day you're going to perform the reclined quad stretch. Remember, getting into that first layer of hip flexors, peeling back the onion. Then after your 3 sets of that, you're moving into either the foot elevated loaded hip flexor stretch or the long lunge back extension. So we're alternating the straight leg variations day to day. So only 2 exercises here. Keep in mind, if you're doing online coaching with me, for example, I like to structure my flexibility sessions with supersets. So I'm typically supersetting an antagonist muscle group where we open up the opposing joint angle. For instance, I may be supersetting the reclined couch stretch with a hamstring stretch variation or a glute stretch variation to improve hip flexion. So we pair one exercise to improve hip extension with one exercise to improve hip flexion, and that tends to work out very well. So a setup like this offers you a lot of room and exploration to train other things in your session. Of course, if you're confused on how to structure your flexibility work for the entire body and program it along with strength, then feel free to reach out and we can discuss online coaching options together. But for now, screenshot this program and get right to work and stick with it for at least 3 months. It takes time to see flexibility adaptations, and everybody's different in how they'll respond. So, patience and respect for the process is the biggest key component with flexibility training. Okay, guys, that's the video and some of my preferred ways to stretch the hip flexors for all levels. So, if you give the program a try, please let me know how you get on in the comments. And if you like the video, please like the video and subscribe. I'm trying to grow the YouTube channel and produce more long-form content. So, I wish you all happy and healthy hips and a nice long stride.